Okay, this is our second installment. So we're moving into discussing Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthals. So we see the first evidence for Homo neanderthalensis around 150,000 years ago. So up to this point, there were archaic Homo sapiens living in Europe. We find fossil hominin that exhibit the characteristics that we associate with archaic Homo sapiens. We only find Neanderthals in Europe. So archaic Homo sapiens, I gave you the list of places that they were found. They're found in Africa, they're found in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia. Neanderthals are only found in this blue shaded region here. So it actually goes much farther than we originally thought it did. So if you'd taken this class 20 years ago or so, they would have said only Europe. But now we have found Neanderthals elsewhere. So they do go into the Middle East, but this Neanderthal range is only this blue shaded region. That's interesting because it implies that when we look at the features associated with Neanderthals, they were adapted to these incredibly cold climates. So they have a very large nose that some anthropologists, and this isn't widely supported, but some anthropologists say possibly was adapted to warming air up before it reached the brain, basically to avoid brain freeze. Again, not always super supported. They had a large cranial capacity. They had a large body. It wasn't tall, so whenever I say a large body, people are like, oh, they must have been 7 feet tall. They were not 7 feet tall. In terms of average height, they may have been slightly below what our average height now is, but in terms of bulk, they were quite large. So they were very muscular and very robust. They had very thick muscle attachments and thick bones themselves. This is a cold adaptation as well. So these are things that we think were well suited. They were selected, natural selection, for this very cold environment that Neanderthals evolved in. We do not find them in Africa. They did not evolve in Africa. So this is very important. People think a lot of the time that humans, hominin, natural selection, and evolution not happening. Absolutely, it is happening. We see evidence of it throughout hominin evolution, and we still see evidence of it today in our presently modern Homo sapiens populations. So don't go thinking that you're exempt or something from evolution and natural selection. As long as we're on this slide, other things that we see that are characteristic of Neanderthals are specific types of teeth. So I discussed dentition last week a little bit. We see unique teeth in Neanderthals. We see weird root complexes in the molars. It's called taurodontism. It's actually this huge root, whereas a modern human root for a molar looks like this. It's got like 3 prongs on it. So this is kind of unusual. We see a thing called a molarized premolar. So this is, a premolar is usually slightly smaller than a molar. We talked about dental formula. This is basically, they have fewer, the premolars, they're still classified as premolars, but they're larger, so they do more work than a molar would do. This is important because molars are important for chewing meat, tough meat. And Neanderthals, I told you, hunt big game. They are sustaining themselves on meat for the majority of the year. So having these molars that are very robust and premolars that are very robust is going to help them do that. So these are, again, adaptations to the environment that they were living in. So we find Neanderthals in a lot of different regions, as I showed you on the map. But the first Neanderthal that was discovered was actually discovered in the 1850s in Neander Valley in Germany. So that's how they got their name. They had these unique skeletal characteristics, but the individual that they actually uncovered there also had some skeletal abnormalities, which led to, when they reproduced what they thought Neanderthals looked like, this sort of concept of this brute, caveman, barbarian type creature that was very much not human. In reality, Neanderthals were very similar to us. Some people say, if a Neanderthal was walking on the street, we wouldn't even realize they were a different species. I don't think that that is true. But they were not, this is actually an early depiction of a Neanderthal. It literally looks like an ape that is living in a cave. That is completely inaccurate. So these are just slightly more robust, a little bit shorter, but a little bit thicker people than us. They have kind of large noses. They don't have a chin. So, and that maybe their head looks a little longer front to back than ours. So these are not dramatically different from us, and that's important. So this is another one of those issues that we discussed when we talked about how Homo habilis had the first stone tools attributed to them. Arguably, part of the historic mindset that separated Neanderthals from us so completely was this idea that, oh my gosh, we can't have a species that so closely resembles us but went extinct. They must have been oafs, they must have been barbarians, they must have beaten each other with sticks until they all killed each other. These are just nonsensical concepts that were really centered around this idea that we are the best and any other species must not be as good as us. In reality, Neanderthals have larger cranial capacities than we do, which probably meant that they had a larger brain than us. We don't know why our species survived and their species went extinct. We don't have the answer to that. But it's outrageous to think that they went extinct because they were just these barbarians. So just understand that a lot of the depictions of Neanderthals and other early hominin are sort of colored by this really, it's beyond ethnocentrism, it's like species centrism that a lot of us have for our own species. So here is a comparison of a Neanderthal skeleton and a modern human skeleton. So you can see they're a little bit shorter, but they're definitely more robust than us. So just realize that. So one of the things that we can do with Neanderthals and we can't do with any other hominin species is examine DNA. Because of the cold climate that they lived in and therefore died in and were preserved in, and because they actually, so 150,000 years ago is when we see the first Neanderthals, but 30,000 years ago is when we kind of stopped seeing Neanderthals. So 30,000 years is not a very long time. So there actually is preserved Neanderthal DNA in some of these skeletons that we find. So these are not fossils at this point. I told you that bone turns into rock or is replaced by rock, and that's effectively what a fossil is. These are still bone. There's still DNA in the bone. So we actually have sequenced the entire Neanderthal genome around 2010. So we can look and see the differences between modern, because we've sequenced our own genome, modern human DNA and Neanderthal DNA. One, not a whole lot of differences, but we expected that because there's not a whole lot of difference between our DNA and chimpanzee DNA. But what we also see is some genes that we actually believe through science, so we have deduced that they come from Neanderthals. So we actually have Neanderthal DNA in our DNA. So rather than saying that Neanderthals went extinct, we no longer see the species, so I don't consider that a completely inaccurate term, but our modern human ancestors, in all likelihood, mated with Neanderthals, and we have some Neanderthal DNA. Now, it didn't happen widespread, it didn't happen across the board, but it happened enough times that we do have Neanderthal DNA. So this is important. One of the questions that we have a lot is why are Neanderthals extinct? Why do we no longer see Neanderthals? Well, one, keep in your head that we have Neanderthal DNA while we discuss this. But two, there are a few different reasons. Health. I told you that the first Neanderthal skeleton that we found had a lot of weird skeletal pathologies and was reconstructed oddly because of that. it looks like there were a lot of diseases in these Neanderthal populations, and very possibly a lot of them were due to vitamin deficiencies. They were living in these very cold climates with very little food, and certainly not a diverse diet, so we see a lot of health issues due to that. We see a lot of really severe skeletal trauma. So they were big game hunting with these big thrusting spears, not throwing spears. So what we see is evidence of really violent lifestyles, especially in terms of hunting. A lot of damage, a lot of crushed skulls. The old man of La Chapelle and the Shanidar Cave, these are two specific individuals who suffered intense skeletal trauma and lived well into adulthood with this skeletal trauma, which also leads us to understand Neanderthal culture a little bit. So, for instance, the individual found in Shanidar Cave, which is in Iraq, had an amputated arm, so they were missing their right arm, and had severe skull trauma, probably were missing an eye. An individual who's missing their likely dominant hand and an eye would not be able to hunt. The old man of La Chapelle had no teeth. In a species where chewing basically beef jerky constantly for subsistence if somebody doesn't have teeth and that's their main form of nutrition, obviously that's going to be a problem. And yet the Shanidar Cave individual and the old man of La Chapelle lived many, many, many years with these injuries, or whatever you want to call them. That allows us to know that there was care between individuals in Neanderthals. So whether it was family groups or social groups, someone else shared their food with both of these individuals. And that is culture. That is really important, to care for the elderly or the injured in a social group. That's part of what we consider human. So this is a very human characteristic that we see evidence of in these Neanderthals. So if you want to think of Homo habilis as being, very archaic and very different from us, you can find evidence for that. You can find evidence against it too. But when it comes to Neanderthals, there are many, many, many similarities between Neanderthals and modern humans. So, there's that. Another thing that we talk about is why there are no Neanderthals. So, there are a few different hypotheses. One is that these diseases and this hard lifestyle actually resulted in a lot of death, and so basically they just couldn't sustain themselves and they just went extinct. They just died out eventually. The climate changed, they were adapted to the cold, and they could no longer survive in a warming climate. Other hypotheses include things like women and infants dying in childbirth. Their cranial capacities were much larger than ours. Childbirth is difficult enough for us. If their babies had larger heads, maybe it was even more difficult for them. Another hypothesis is that literally we killed them. So modern humans came into the areas where Neanderthals had been living. We basically murdered them in their sleep. We don't see a lot of evidence for that. We don't see evidence of warfare or anything like that. If our species was responsible for their death, it probably was more out of competition and we killed more animals or took more of their resources than they could afford to lose. But we don't really know why there are no Neanderthals anymore. There certainly were always fewer Neanderthals than there were modern humans because of the climate. So we'll continue this discussion in the third installment, where we'll start with this cold adaptation.